Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. The fatal stabbing of a 10-year-old Japanese boy in Shenzhen, China, on the anniversary of Japan's 1931 invasion of China's northeast has triggered calls for Beijing to rein in online anti-Japanese sentiment. 3 months earlier in Suzhou, Jiangsu province, a Japanese mother and her preschool child were attacked at a Japanese school bus stop. A 54-year-old female Chinese bus attendant was fatally stabbed while trying to protect them. The motive behind each attack remains unclear, but anti-Japanese sentiment, especially online, has been rising in China since the release of treated and diluted water from Japan's Fukushima nuclear plant in 2023. On the day the schoolboy passed away, Tokyo announced that China agreed to resume imports of Japanese seafood, which it had banned, citing safety issues relating to Fukushima. How bad is anti-Japanese sentiment in China? What's behind it? And to what extent is xenophobia and nationalism driven by China's government? Joining us today are Lai I-chung, Prospect Foundation President, and Brian Hioe, New Bloom magazine founding editor. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. On the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly on September 19th, the morning the Japanese schoolboy passed away in hospital, Japanese Foreign Minister Kamikawa Kyoko conveyed what she had asked of her Chinese counterpart Wang Yi.
在中国大使館および在広州総領事館から中国側に対し事実関係の説明を求めるとともに日本人の安全確保について万全を期すよう強く求めたところであります。
Wang told Kamikawa that the attack was an isolated case and urged Japan to react calmly. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said in a statement, China will investigate and handle this isolated attack on a Japanese student in Shenzhen in accordance with the law and will ensure the safety of all foreign citizens in China as always. Japan should treat the matter calmly and rationally and avoid politicization and amplification. So, President Lai, let me come to you first. Given that Japan had asked China to to ensure the safety of Japanese schools ahead of that very important September 18th anniversary, how do you read Beijing's response?
I think the Beijing response contained two things. First of all, Beijing already believed that this is an isolated event, so that in the statement, I'd like to emphasize that. Also, the Beijing indicate that they warned Japan not to politicize and demand Japan to act calmly and rationally, which indicates that there's a certain belief that the politicizations could be the issues. But I think what China did in the response in this time actually missed the whole point. That is, Japan is asking that China, you had to give us a reason. You had to make sure the safety of our citizens living in your country. Because this is not just one incident. 3 months earlier, this was already attack against Japan, the mother and the preschool boys.
Now, so do you think that China is taking this seriously enough? Is that the impression that they're giving?
No, I do not think they are taking this seriously enough, because China is actually indicating in the issue that Japan, you should avoid politicizations. But Japan is asking China, how are you going to do to ensure the safety of our people in your country? And China answered none of those. So in Japan's eyes, that this incident is not just once, but twice. And also it happened on September 18th.
Let's go to that now, President Lai. So the Japanese schoolboy was attacked on September 18th, which is the anniversary of the 1931 Mukden incident, a railway explosion which Japan used as a pretext to invade Manchuria, which is now northeast China. Many videos with the theme, Don't Forget the National Humiliation, have been circulating on the Chinese video platform Douyin in 2024. They incorporated imagery of Japanese schools across China with a message that China is, quote, being occupied by Japan. So if I now bring in Brian, to what extent is Japan's brutal history, is it a part of this, the current tensions?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's definitely the subtext for this incident. And that occurs around this time. For example, I think China has several conflicting imperatives here. One is that it wishes to reassure the Japanese business community that's safe.
Is it doing that? I mean, that was my question to President Lai.
To some extent, it wishes to have these ties, but then it does find the anti-Japanese nationalism useful for its own purposes, particularly around these holidays. And so it is part of China's narrative about deserving a place in the world that it is avenging or reenacting and kind of revising this past history of this century of humiliation.
President Lai, and to what extent do you think Beijing has therefore allowed, this rising nationalism, xenophobia, anti-Japanese sentiment?
I think it is official policy of the Beijing. They wanted to emphasize that, and particularly use the 1931, the Wigton incidents, as a rally cry that China has experienced this anti-Japan struggle. That is about how the nation at that time being invaded by Japan, they were able to fight back. And that defines the whole the modern Chinese history about what China is doing, why China need to have this system, the whole national system, and try to get all the resources all together because China has to be strong so that it won't be humiliated again, like in 1931 by Japan. So that is the whole thing that China wanted to emphasize and to legitimize the current government, its policy towards its own people, as well as its policy to the outside.
Right. So, Brian, do you agree? It's not just that it has turned a blind eye, the government in Beijing, but it's actually a specific policy to whip up that nationalism and that xenophobia.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly is. I think also the Chinese government is cautious, though, when Chinese nationalism grows out of control beyond what is able to control itself. And so it wishes to direct this anger towards certain ends. But sometimes when Chinese nationalists criticize the state, for example, for not doing enough, for not being harsh enough on Japan, then the state perhaps does encounter some issues. Because it does enjoy these business ties, I think, even if it does want to have more geopolitical action directed towards Japan.
Yes, absolutely. And what I raised earlier with you was, from the response of Wang Yi and from that statement that we read out at the beginning, from President Lai's perspective, they weren't taking it seriously enough. So that would be a message surely that the Japanese would get because, as well as saying, don't politicize, don't try to amplify this, they also said, we will ensure the safety as always. And yet there have been 2 incidents very close together where Japanese people have been attacked. So are they taking it seriously? Is the message being got through?
I think it's a good question, because particularly, for example, one looks at some materials that the Chinese government is circulating about not speaking to foreigners, about potential sensitive secrets, and often the foreigner is depicted as a Westerner. So it's not just Japanese people as well. I think there is this rising xenophobia at a time of rising tensions between China and the world. But then Japan in particular, there's this historical enmity. And so I think the government also doesn't want to offend the Chinese nationalists, for example, that perhaps would carry out such acts because they are also a constituent and they do need to maintain this political legitimacy in their eyes.
Okay. Now, opinion polls indicate that anti-Japanese sentiment remains strong in China. A 2020 report by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences noted that Japan was perceived as China's, quote, most unfriendly country. About 100,000 Japanese students, employees and others live in China. Bloomberg has reported that Japanese companies are beginning to abandon investment in China, with Nippon Steel, the biggest, earliest investor into China, announcing it was exiting its joint venture in China. In 2023, there were around 31,000 Japanese businesses, down by 1/10 from 2020, according to Japan's foreign ministry. And almost half of Japanese firms in China polled in a recent Bloomberg survey said they won't spend more or will cut investment this year. So, President Lai, let me come to you. What's the significance of the Japanese businesses in China, the Japanese FDI? How has that contributed to China's rise?
If you look at Japan-China economic relations, especially when China started to come back to the modernization during the 80s, its reform opening policy, the biggest source of the foreign direct investment actually came from Japan. It's not United States. So the Japan investment since the 1980s has been a very constant source of the foreign capitals to help China to connect to the outside world in terms of the market capitalism, but also for the domestic constructions. And we also need to know that before China really put out its foreign the diplomats the important post before the United States, normalization between U.S. and China, the important post of the China foreign diplomats is actually in Japan. And the many of, if you look at it, some in the past, the Chinese senior diplomats, they all have their important posting in Japan as part of our portfolio in order to rise up. And so that basically means that how the Japan has been an important source for China to connect to the outside.
So you were saying that, you know, the diplomatic relations with China, between China and Japan, had always been strong, and that was built on a basis of an economic foundation. But what we're seeing now is that perhaps is changing very sadly, and then that might, the economic and both the diplomatic ties are starting to fray.
My emphasis is actually not just about how the political relations based upon the economic relationship, but also the political relationship, even within China. The relation with Japan is so important that in terms of the Chinese overall external engagement.
But why is it important? Is it for economic development?
Because if you look at the sequence of the normalizations, the Japan normalized its relation with China 7 years earlier than the U.S. Normalized relation with China. And Japan is also the one Asian country in the G7 would like to push forward for the normalization with China earlier than others. So that when the whole East Asia, including the Korea at that time, they still have a very strong anti-communist sentiment. Japan is the one that really pushed forward.
Right.
So that's a key difference.
Yeah. So you're saying in essence that China owes its rise, its acceptance into the international community in large part due to Japan.
Yeah, Japan is almost like a lobbyist for China on China's behalf within G7, within United Nations, and in Asia.
Right.
All the way until I think the year 2000s.
Okay, so this what we're witnessing now is a huge structural change then for this relationship. Brian, let's talk about the seafood import ban, and now it's looks like it will be gradually released on condition. Tell us about how you think, you know, China's reaction to that in 2023. How did that contribute or not towards feelings towards Japan in China?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think China really took advantage of the decision by the Japanese government to release the nuclear wastewater to frame Japan as irresponsible in terms of its commitments to the international community, because China would like to take up that position, framing itself as responsible. And in this sense, I think particularly China's draw on this historical memory of Japanese colonialism. And some of the other countries in the region, which also suffered through Japanese colonialism, had similar reactions, I think, to the wastewater release. And so it's quite interesting to see this come up in that sense. And I expect it to continue to be a matter of contention. I think it's very useful political ammo for China regarding Japan, and will be for some time.
And so, President Lai, do you agree with Brian there that Beijing politicized the issue of the release of the water?
Yeah, definitely, especially if you look at how Beijing is treating its own nuclear power plant and the wastewater. I think several years ago we do some comparison studies and found out that about Beijing's nuclear power plants, the wastewater they release to the sea, like 10 times or 20 times higher than Japan's. And also the wastewater, China claimed that will be contaminating the Pacific Oceans. Those water actually have been tested by the IAEA as that's within the boundary that's acceptable. So that I would say the issue is that China criticized Japan for the things that it's actually doing itself to others. And at the same time that China choose not to recognize the fact that the IAEA has sanctioned this result as this acceptable. So politicizations, the tactic used by China, I think that is the name of the game here.
Right. So Brian, we're trying to piece together, or trying to understand where, you know, this hatred of Japanese in China has come from. What are the components of it? We also need to talk about the 2023 anti-espionage law that China introduced, and also the detention of the Japanese executive from a pharmaceutical company in March of 2023.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there is this widening climate of fear. I mean, regarding the recent stabbings, many Japanese members of the business community in China are afraid and want to go back. But then in the past, we saw this as well with Westerners, for example, regarding the detention of the two Michaels, who are, of course, Canadian, around the time that Hioe was very much in the news. And so I think part of it's this attempt to signal that perhaps some actions are not tolerable. It's very hard to piece together from the outside what China is attempting to signal towards, for example, Western or Japanese businessmen in China. But it's clear that some actions will fall afoul of people, and one cannot tell sometimes if they're isolated cases, but then there does seem to be a broader hostility, I think, that one can feel from China.
But what was it in particular about the anti-espionage law in terms of rallying the public?
So I think what's interesting is China is really trying to build up a narrative of outside infiltrators. Around 2019, for example, was the Hong Kong protests, and they even claim Taiwan is an outside infiltrator, with claims that thousands of Taiwanese spies have been detected in China, for example. And so I think it's part of a general narrative and often tilts towards framing Western forces or historical enemies of China, such as Japan, as the source of interference in domestic affairs, which leads to social unrest.
And President Lai, the call when that law was basically introduced and implemented, it was described as essentially mobilizing the masses, of bringing them into this anti-espionage campaign, you know, saying that they have a duty as Chinese to root out these spies from foreign spies which are operating in China. For you, how significant was that particular law in terms of Japanese feelings towards Japanese?
I think at that time when the legislation is being proposed and passed, at that time a lot of the people thought that probably that's Chinese countermeasure against the United States at that time about the various legislation that U.S. had about how to prevent its commercial secrets, its technology from leaking to China. And so that China come up with its own law trying to do that. Do that things against the U.S. as well. But then when the legislation came out and it started to execute this legislation and various arrests, like there are already several Japanese engineers and business and high councils have been arrested in China, and one of them even has to rely on the foreign ministers. Hayashi went to China in order to rescue that person out. So that people started to find out that there are certain differences in terms of how these legislations are different from the United States, its own measure against China. Because it seems to be now that the legislation is also a tool to prevent its domestic populace to talk to the outsiders. Because by talking to the outsiders, you could also be implicated as you are aiding for the foreign spies or you are colluding with the foreign spies.
Right. And so we saw the picture, Brian, there of, and I think you mentioned the climate of fear. There's also the segregation, isn't it? As the President said, encouraging or discouraging Chinese citizens from talking to foreigners. Moving back to the school, why do you think that Japanese schools, in the two instances that we talked about, Suzhou and Shenzhen, were targeted rather than businesses, rather than homes being targeted?
Yeah, I think it probably is just that it prevents a convenient target. It's something that you see, and you see, let's say, Japanese children in the neighborhood and parents, and it's a symbol of perhaps someone views encroachment, because I think with businesses, perhaps the footprint in the community is not as large, and so I think in terms of visible presence. So I think it just was a convenient target. Right. But I think that raises the possibility of just civilians being caught up in just this nationalist anger. Random people are just going about their lives.
Right, right. And President Lai, there were some rumors on or narratives on Chinese social media about schools actually being, you know, the breeding ground for espionage, foreign espionage, particularly the Japanese schools.
Espionage.
Yeah.
Well, that's news to me, because I never know how could a 11 or even a 3 years old could be a espionage case for Japan or for others against China. But I will say that when we talk about the two incidents happening that attack the underage children, Japanese children living in China, that also tells us that there's something very different from the Chinese feeling toward Japan and the general Chinese general feeling toward the foreigners. It seems that Japan has the hatred toward Japan, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, has been the policy of the government. Started to take that the anti-Japan is a defining moment for China right now. Rather than China is strong, so that we're able to stand even with anyone else, putting that as a pride for this nation. But the constant reminding people that the modern day Japan is like the Japan about 100 years ago on the military and the invasions, that come back to define the modern China. So all the Chinese, they've been grown to be taught that they need to really fight against Japanese, not just Japan as a nation, but Japanese people, they're also evil.
Are you actually saying that they, in a sense, they point to Japan in the pre-World War II or during World War II as that military hegemon, and in a sense, they are becoming that themselves? China is becoming that.
I would say that in a funny way that when China is said that it's fighting against the Imperial Japan at that time, it's actually becoming the mirror image of Imperial Japan now.
Yeah.
So that's a sad thing.
Very interesting. Brian, just coming back though, the counter to that is, if we look at the announcement to resume imports of seafood, how do we read that then in terms of what we've just discussed? That obviously is a softening. I mean, it's not quite a U-turn, but the agreement to resume gradually, even gradually, imports, whereas before they were saying that this is dangerous for health and safety. They were saying that Japan was passing on an open wound onto the future generations of humanity by releasing this wastewater. So how do you see this? How does that fit in?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it does show that trade ties with Japan are actually still important for China and the Chinese government. But then in the meantime, the Chinese government would like to pretend otherwise, and in the meantime is more interested in sometimes drumming up and seeking to direct and control this anti-Japanese sentiment towards its geopolitical aims. And so that maybe shows where the government is not necessarily being so honest to Chinese nationalists that are acting on this kind of anger, which the government itself sort of propagates through its own propaganda and its messaging and its specific political actions.
Right. Very interesting theme there of honesty. Now, the Shenzhen Japanese school, where the victim of the stabbing was a student, has received hundreds of bouquets of condolence flowers from Chinese people. More than 50 Chinese expats in Tokyo also organized a candlelit memorial for the boy. Lawyer Lai I-chung, 51, said, "We wanted to convey to the Japanese people that not all Chinese are like the perpetrator." The boy's Japanese father penned a letter saying, "All I can do is continue to make a small contribution to fostering understanding between Japan and China. This will be my way of atoning for my beloved son and my form of retribution to the perpetrator." President Lai, that letter that the father posted on social media, he actually wanted that to be spread because, as we heard there, he wants to continue to foster relations between the two countries. However, it was taken down by the Chinese state. It was removed from China's social media. Now, what do you think it will take for both sides to improve relations, which are very significant relations between two powers?
No, I do not think there's both sides. There's only one side, that is China. China, government needs to do something. I'm glad that there are Chinese people come out and express their condolences toward the victim. And would like to emphasize to Japanese society that not all Chinese people are like that. We are here, we express our sympathy, and we want to have a rational relationship and human-to-human interactions. That is the kind of message that people need to hear. But that message, unfortunately, came from the civilian, the non-governmental peoples. How is a Chinese government would like to do things in order to amend the current situations? to address the problem already that been so sickening to a lot of people, that they're taking a hatred toward Japan as a national policy, and that picture has a very distorted picture about the whole Japan society, and that is something that needs to be addressed. And I do not think that right now the Japan has a policy about hatred toward China. So China needs to, as a government, need to do something. And unfortunately, I haven't seen anything from them right now.
Right. Brian, I want your take on that. Do you agree that mostly the responsibility is with China to change its policy, of this nationalism and xenophobia directed at Japan, and specifically to stop painting Japan as it was pre-World War II, 70 years ago? Yeah, that it's a different country now.
I think the interesting thing is that there is hatred on both sides. I mean, there's also anti-Chinese sentiment in Japan, for example, towards Japanese who are of Chinese descent, and that is something that has been ongoing. And there's this enmity, of course. But then the Chinese government does not actually like to see strong ties with Japan from the civilian population. Japan has tremendous soft power in China, for example, and that's something the Chinese government has always found very cautious. There were some very strange moments, for example, when the Japanese manga creator Akira Toriyama died, and then the foreign ministry offered condolences. And that reflects that, I think. And the fact that there are Chinese people living in Tokyo reflects that there are Chinese people that feel an affinity for Japan and have ended up living there. And that's not something the Chinese government necessarily likes to see. And so I think that does explain why it also felt this need to tamp down on perhaps a learning moment that have come out of this tragedy.
Mm. And President Lai, so do you think there is any hope?
I just like to emphasize the key is actually in the resides on China, Chinese government, to reorient their educations, to redefine their national identities. Right now, China is not humiliated. China is already strong, the number 2 economy in the whole world, and everyone knows China is very strong. So everyone is actually intimidated by China rather than they like to take advantage of China. And the government needs to recognize that realities.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Lai I-chung, Brian Hioe, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for Taiwan Plus.
Taiwan Plus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.